each shever has to be 3 truas. So three shevers is each one's 3 truas. How many truas are there in a shever? And shvarim? There's 9.
Right?
So the tekiyas before and after, they have to be as long as the whatever you're blowing in the middle. So if it's shvarim trua, they have to be 18 what are called trumitin. If you're doing just shvarim, then the tekiya has to be 9 trumitin.
What if you're doing this true?
If you're doing just trua, so then no matter how long, even if you do 100, even do 100 of them, you only have to do a tekiya, which is 9 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Is this from true? Listen.
Yeah, I heard you did it. Yes, yeah. And if you don't do it properly, then you have to repeat it. So that's these are the laws of Shofar. Okay. You tell me when you're ready, Paul. We're chapter 12 of the Rambam. Good morning. We're going to go chapter 12 of the Rambam. This is a very, very beautiful halachis today. You can't blow shofar now, Mendel. If you want, you can go outside. Okay. If you light up kol shehu, you're going to miss Rambam, Mendel. If you light up even a little bit on Shabbos, you start a fire, even a small fire to burn something, you strike a match, chayev, you're liable. V'hu sheitzarech le'efer. You're only liable if there's a positive purpose. For example, if you're burning a match and you want the ashes, then you are chayev. However, if you are burning something to destroy it, you're lighting something up to destroy it, you are exempt, but it is forbidden because you were mekalkel, because you were destructive. So again, if the fire has a good purpose, then you're liable. If it has a negative purpose, then you are pater aval aser, you are exempt from punishment, but it's forbidden. If you light up your friend's house or your friend's property, his produce, even though you are liable, even though you're mashchus, even though you're being destructive, because you're obviously trying to hurt him. And when you hurt him, you're getting a certain level of satisfaction. And that is similar to if you're tearing clothing because you die or out of rage, that you're liable. And it's similar if you're hurting someone in a fight, even though when you hurt someone, you give them a bruise. Even though you're hurting someone, giving them a bruise and everything like that, you're liable because it gives you a certain feeling of satisfaction to your yetzer hara. Similarly, if you light up a candle or wood, whether to be warm or for light, you're liable. If you heat up metal in order to change its shape in water, this is a tolda of mavir. You're heating it up so you already have a fire. You're sticking metal in, even though, and you're doing it for a purpose to change the metal, even though you're not lighting a fire. That is a tolda, that is an offshoot, and you have committed the sin of lighting, and you are liable. If you put out any fire at any level, you are liable. Whether it's a candle or you're putting out coal made out of wood. However, coal made out of metal, so if you have metal which is heat up and you pour water on it, even though you're putting out the heat, you are exempt. And if you're doing that in order to work the metal, for example, people do when they work with iron, they heat it up until it becomes a coal, and then they put it in water in order to seal it. This is liable. So general rule is whatever you're doing heat up with for a purpose, you're liable. Even if there might be opposite actions, you can be liable in some cases and exempt in some cases. Now, let's say there's a hot metal, molten metal in a public domain, people are walking by, you're allowed to put it on Shabbos in order that somebody does not get hurt, in order people don't step in and get hurt. If you put oil, let's say you have a candle, and you add oil into it, you add fuel, you're liable because of mavir. Let's say you need olive oil and you have olive oil lit on your Shabbos candles, which some people have the tradition to use oil for Shabbos candles, some people don't. But let's say you say, okay, I need some oil from the salad, and you take some of the oil, you're liable because you're putting out the candle sooner. You're liable because mechaber. Now 3 is famous halachis, which I think there's a very deep level of learning we could do from that. Let's say a fire starts on Shabbos and it's burning your house down or burning something down. You're not allowed to put it out. And if you put it out because you're going to lose money, you're liable. Because losing money never changes the laws of Shabbos. Never changes the laws of Shabbos. Losing life, ibud nefashes. If someone's going to lose their life, then that does break Shabbos. And therefore, people can go out so they don't die, but they should leave the fire to burn, even if it burns down the whole country. It's the law Rambam is quoting from the Talmud. You can make, now, even though you're not allowed to put the fire, there are certain things you could do on Shabbos that maybe can help prevent or help stop the fire, but you can't put it out. So you can make a wall of vessels, whether they're full of water or not, in order that if you have, let's say, you put a bunch of cups of water at a certain point, you make a circle around the fire, eventually the cups will melt or not, but they will stop the fire. The fire will not spread through the water. Whether they're empty or full, in order so the fire shouldn't pass. Even brand new klei cheres chadashim. So here you have basically you have new vessels, which is very interesting because someone asked me a couple years ago. He told me he was camping and someone in Prescott, he put in a cup of styrofoam cup of water in the fire to see what would happen, and he said it didn't melt, it didn't break because the water kept it. Now, here he says if you have cheres chadashim, brand new earthenware vessels, and you know if you take brand new earthenware vessels, you fill them with water, you make a wall, you know for sure they're going to break, for sure they're going to bust, and put out the fire, then it's permitted. And you can put a plate on top of a candle in order that it could block it from catching onto the wood. A box or a chicken coop or different things that catch fire, you can put leather on top of them because that doesn't catch fire. And you can put it on the side that fire didn't catch it in order that the fire won't pass through there. If you have a garment that caught fire, you can take it off and cover it, and if it goes out, it goes out. And similar to Sefer Torah, which casts fire, you can open it and read from it. And if it goes out, it goes out. So it's very, very strict if you have something that catches fire.
If they let a Torah burn?
Yeah, in a certain context, yeah. And you could put water from the side that didn't get the fire, and if it goes out, it goes out. So these laws, I think the reason why they're so important is these laws probably are the strongest example of surrender that we can have with the laws of Shabbos. If you forget a candle burning on top of something, you can move that thing and it will fall, and if it goes out, it goes out. However, if you put it there before night, even though it goes out, it's forbidden to move it. So you forgot a candle burning on the table catches fire, the candle spills over, you can knock the table so it falls on the ground and maybe it will go out. However, if you purposely put it there, you're not allowed to move it. A Gentile comes and he sees a fire. Firemen come, the neighbors call, and they put it out. You're not allowed to tell them, put out, and you don't have to tell them, don't put it out. Because they're perfectly allowed to put it out. However, a child does it, you have to stop him, because if he's doing it for his father, you have to stop him. But if he's doing it for himself, the Beis Din does not have to stop him. And when there's a fire, the rabbi said, hey, anyone who puts it out will not lose. Now we're going to the next mitzvah, which is actually the next several chapters. And this is a very, very, one of the most complicated mitzvahs on Shabbos, the mitzvah of not carrying. It's the next 5 or 6 chapters. Taking out from one domain to another domain is a malacha. It is work on Shabbos, and it's me'avos malacha. So this is one of the most tricky ones because I just carry. What's the big deal? If I carry inside, it's no problem. Right now, I just carry across this line. I suddenly have to give a sacrifice and I get death penalty. Even though it's not, even though that this thing with all the things are passed down from Moses, it says in the Torah, Ish v'isha al yasu malacha l'trumas hakodesh v'yikali aham mahavi. It says in the Torah that everyone should stop bringing to give their gifts to the tabernacle. We learn from here that bringing is a job. It's a malacha. And we also learn that if you take from a public domain, you carry from the beginning of 4 almas 6 feet until after 6 feet, this is the same thing as taking from a public to a private or private to a public. So you're not allowed to carry outside from the beginning of 6 feet to after 6 feet. You are not liable for carrying, number 9. You're not taking from one domain to another, and you're not you're not liable until you take like the measurement which helps from a private domain to a public domain or public domain to a private domain. And so you basically, number one, you in order to be liable, you have to pick it up in one domain and put it down in another domain. However, if you pick it up but you never put it down, or you put it down but you never picked it up, or you take less than the amount that we're going to say, there's certain times that there's an amount which is not considered carrying, less than is not considered carrying, you are exempt. Similarly, if you take from the beginning of 4 amos to end of 4 amos, you're not liable until you pick it up and put it down. So you need to pick it up and put it down. Now, we'll talk about if you walk, you stop and you have something in your pocket, and you walk, is that considered picking up? And if you stop, is that considered putting down? So we'll talk about that. If you go throw from one, so that is example number one. If you have to pick up and put it down, and it has to be the proper shear. And again, this is quite complex. If you throw from inside one domain to another domain, or you pass it, right? So you're standing in one domain, but you're passing it outside to the other domain. You are, this is a tolda, this is an offshoot, and you're liable. Similarly, if you pass it, so you're standing within, here you have 4 amos, you have 6 feet, you're standing within the 4 amos, and you pass it out of the 4 amos, right? I didn't go out of the 6 feet outside, so I'm sitting in the street, I have something in my hand, and I pass it out of the 6 feet, then this is also considered liable. But if you throw it in an unusual way, for example, let's say you have something on the back of your hand and you throw it like this, that is exempt, but it's forbidden. Okay, let's say you have half an object. Part of the object you take out, you're exempt until you take out the whole object. A box which has a lot of things, even if it's filled up with mustard seed, and you take most of it from one rishus to another rishus, you are exempt until you take the whole box. These things, they have, because the vessel that's holding it is considered like a whole object, and the whole object, so let's say you have a box and there's 2 books, and you only take out half the box. So half the one object is outside the line and one is inside the line. You're exempt until the whole object, because when you're holding in a box, then the box becomes the object. So I just want to mention that in the Talmud, in the Talmud of Shabbos, what is the first mitzvah in the first Mishnah on Shabbos? The first Mishnah is the laws of carrying. And the rabbis in the Talmud say, why is that? They say because it's an unusual job. You're not really working, you're not really doing anything, but it has, all these laws are from Moses at Sinai. So it has it's such an unusual law that has so many details from Moses at Sinai. It's such a complex law, and yet it's in the Torah, it's from God, and therefore that's why we start off in the Malachis, but in the Talmud, before it even introduces and says there's a law of carrying, it starts going into the details, how complex the details are, because it says we know this is such a complex law. Okay. If you take it out, whether your right hand, whether your left hand, whether it's on your torso, or you have money tied up in a wallet or in a handkerchief, you're liable because you're taking it out the way that you carry. So a lot of malachis, we said if you do with your left hand, you're not liable. But carrying, people do with their left hand. When they go to the groceries, they have 2 bags. And there's so many ways of carrying, so it doesn't really matter. You're liable in all those ways. And similarly, if you take it out on your shoulder, you're liable, even though it's hot. Now, even though, as we'll say later, that the level of 10 handbreadths above a domain is considered a different domain, right? So if it's on my shoulder, I might say vertically. So it's almost like at 10 handbreadths is considered a different domain. We'll talk about that later. The Rambam is introducing very slightly here. So you might say, hey, I put it on my shoulder, a book, inside the house, and now I'm walking outside carrying it on my back, on my shoulder. It's in a different domain. It's above the public domain outside. The rule is even though technically it's in a different domain, you're liable, because that's how the people of the tribe of Kahas would carry in the Mishkan. They would carry on their shoulders, and that's the work they would do on Shabbos. It's literally the work they would do. However, let's say you take it in an unusual way. You have a bag of groceries and you carry it with your mouth and your armpit. You hang it on your ear. You tie it to your hair, or you sew it. It's sewed onto your clothing. or all these different examples which are unusual, since it's not the proper way of taking out, it's not the proper way of doing work, so you are exempt. If you carry something on your head, if it's very heavy, for example, it's a full bag or box, which people carry on their head, then you're liable. Because, we know in different countries nowadays, and Jewish people in the Middle East, they would carry things on their head. And you put it on your head and you hold it with your hand. But it comes out, it's like taking it on your shoulder or with your hand. However, if you take something light, for example, you have a clothing or a knife or a book, and you take it out and you're not holding it with your hand, this is exempt, because people don't put light things on your head. People will put heavy things on their head in order to carry it. And most people don't carry small things on their head without holding it. If you carry an object from the beginning of 4 to the end of 4 in the public domain, even though you took it on your head, you're still chayiv. Okay, so here's what you have. And the rule is, in halacha, is your 4 amas, if you would take a person and make a circle around him within 6 feet, that's considered like your domain technically. It doesn't really belong to you, but a person has to do with those things. So if there's something in that area that you're responsible for it, if I want to give something to you and I put it within your reach, then it's considered as if I gave it to you. So here also, if you leave that domain, so let's say a poor person on Shabbos who's stuck in 4 amas, he cannot take out objects from his 4 amas, but within he can technically carry.
You can carry within.
You can. Well, we don't, because it's hard to keep track. But if you, let's say, do have something and you carry it, then you're liable. You carry it outside of that 4 amas. So what we mentioned earlier, let's say it's an emergency. So what you should do is you should carry it within the 4 amas and then put it down on the ground. And then pick it up and then carry it within 4 amas and put it down. Okay.
So you put it down within the 6 feet, or
Yeah.
and then you step outside the 6 feet. You can.
No, in other words, you put it in and then you put it down. And we're going to say this soon. And now you pick it up, your 4 amas
Oh, so
now
shifted.
extend, right? Because every time you pick it up, your 4 amas now extend.
I got it.
A person can carry in the public domain within his 4 amas. By 4 amas, which he's standing in them, and he can carry in this square. And he can measure from where he's standing. And if he's very small, he could put it with 4 amas. It doesn't, even though an amma literally means from here, elbow to finger, it's the average person measurement. And we learn that it says in the Torah, shavu, a person should rest under himself. He shouldn't carry outside of this. But in this square, which is like the length of a person when he extends his arms, and that he's able to carry. If there are 2 people, and their 4 amas overlap, they can go and they eat in the middle as long as they don't take out from each other's. And if there are 3 people and the middle one is between them, he can join them and they can join him, and but the outside areas are forbidden on each other. Therefore, it is permitted for a person to pick up something outside and give it to his friend who's within his 4 amas. And similarly, his friend to his friend on the side, even 100. So technically speaking, if you have 100 people and their 4 amas overlap, we can pass things to each other, right? Because our 4 amas overlap. And even though it's going to go many, many miles on Shabbos. So this is a way that you can carry if it's emergency, or let's say you go outside and you see a pair of tefillin outside on the ground, and you know they're going to be driven over or disgraced. And money you can't touch on Shabbos, right? That's another problem. So money you wouldn't be able to do, but let's say someone accidentally took a sitter outside and they left it by the street. So what we could do is we could make a line of people and pass it to each other, because no one is carrying outside of his 4 amas. Therefore, and now the Rambam says, because a person can carry in this whole square, which is 4 amas by 4 amas, comes out that he can carry in the length, the diagonal of this, 5 amas and 3/5 of an amma. Therefore, you are not liable until you pass it 5 amos and 3/5 of an amma, right? You got that? So you have basically a square, the Torah says. It's not a circle, like I said, it's a square, and therefore, technically speaking, that could always be the diagonal direction. So if you put yourself in this, that could always be the diagonal direction. So really, it's 4 amos in each direction. If you can imagine this square shifting, so it's a little bit longer. You're not liable until you do that. And anytime we say from the beginning of 4 to the end of 4, or 4 amos chayev, this is from the beginning until the end. And if you carry it less than this, you are exempt. So it's a really interesting thing. We're going to explain more details, and the details we're going to explain are really going to change all of this, because we said if you pick up an object and put it down, you have to, in order to be liable, you have to pick it up and put it down. But what we're going to see later on is, what about when you're walking? You begin walking, that's considered picking up, and when you stop walking, that's considered putting down. So actually, if you carry something in your pocket, potentially you could be liable a bunch of times. And even one opinion in the Talmud says every time you take a step, it's considered putting down. Right? Because you're technically, every time you take a step, you're technically stopping. You're going and stopping. So that could change everything. But anyways, we'll go through it. And it comes out to 3 measurements. If you pick something up in Rosh Hashanah in a public domain from one place, and you put it in another place in a public domain, if there is between this space 4 amos, if there is between these two places until 4 amos, it's permitted. If there is more than 4 amos, and you're still within 5 1/5, then in 3/5, you are exempt. If there is between these places 5 and 3/5, then you are liable, because you took it out technically on the diagonal. Then that you took it out in the diagonal section, and therefore you carry it out of your own private domain in the Rishus Harabim, in the public domain. Let me just let me see the commentary here. So the Ravid explains. So the Rambam says it's permitted. The Ravid, he says, well, you're not really supposed to do it, and we don't do it nowadays. And so therefore, and the Ravid actually, who is the famous rabbi who disagrees with the Rambam, when the Rambam says it's permitted, he says all this that we say permitted to carry within 4, that's all if you're stuck. In other words, you shouldn't say carry outside and do any of those tricks. That's all if you come to a situation. So an example like this is, let's say you end up Shabbos stuck in the street, in the desert, right? So you're only allowed to carry it in the 4 amos. And this that he says forbidden until you get to 5 3/5. The Ravid says it's not forbidden. Also, if you're stuck, then you're allowed to carry underneath that amount of time. The Rambam says over 4 amos until 5 3/5 is forbidden. It's exempt but forbidden. So he disagrees, and he says no, all these things are if you're stuck. That's how we do it nowadays. Nowadays we will not. We really shouldn't carry outside unless we're stuck. Now, examples of that might be, we'll see later examples of certain things we're allowed to carry. If it comes to certain situations, we're allowed to carry.
Does he talk about an Eruv at all?
Yes, in the laws of Eruvin. The Rambam, interestingly enough, has a very strict policy on Eruv. A really good read on the Eruv is the grave book over there. And I was actually surprised how strict he is. What he basically says there is, as we'll see in the Rambam, Eruvs are very, very complicated. And therefore, the Rambam would not validate a lot of the Eruvs nowadays. And in the Grey Book there, he goes through and he says, Eruv is a really big loophole in many ways, and there's many opinions that different types of Eruvs don't fall into. So he recommends not carrying in a lot of Eruvs unless you really have to. Except for certain ones in there. And he says most of the Eruvs nowadays are copied from the Warsaw Eruv, which Warsaw was a big city, and they had an Eruv. But he said nowadays, then they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have water, they didn't have all these things that we all have all in our private houses. So he says the Warsaw Eruv was literally to people could live. They could get water on Shabbos, they could draw water, So Eruv is a very interesting Eruv is a very interesting subject. We'll get to it. We're not. The mechanism of Eruv is much different than people think. People think Eruv is like a loophole, where it's kind of like, you could do anything and just put up a string. But really, our Eruv is so technical, and many cities which have Eruvs, like the Manhattan Eruv, the Los Angeles Eruv, there are great poskim nowadays who invalidate the Eruv in Manhattan and say, and there are many who say that Rav Moshe Feinstein was against the Eruv in Manhattan, and the Eruv in Brooklyn, and the Eruv in L.A. And there were other rabbis who followed certain opinions, and it's such a heated topic. So what some rabbis say is there's certain series, like Phoenix is actually known to have a really good Eruv. Phoenix has 2 Eruvs, and it's known to be like very high qualities. Because there's a whole area where Jews don't really live. So instead of making and Phoenix Eruv essentially relies Phoenix has a lot of freeway walls, so they essentially rely on those walls to make the Eruv, and they basically, so technicality to make one large Eruv in Phoenix is very difficult. Phoenix Eruv is known to be quite a good Eruv. Manhattan Eruv, LA Eruv are, so a lot of rabbis say you should put an Eruv, but you shouldn't tell anybody. Also a mistake is a lot of people, when they have an Eruv, they don't realize you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. And what happens is they'll come to Prescott and they don't even know you're not allowed to carry. And you tell them, you're not allowed to carry your book on Shabbos. And, so that is another thing. Now, there's different Eruvs around the world, which the rule of the Eruv, generally speaking, is the smaller the areas, but there's so many technicalities, as we'll see later, of different opinions. We're going to see the Rambam. The Rambam is pretty strict, and a lot of rabbis, and the Alter Rebbe is very strict. And the Rambam, there's so many categories of what. So the Rambam is very strict. A lot of Eruvs nowadays, the Rambam would disqualify. And so there are a lot of rabbis. In Jewish law, it doesn't usually work in Shulchan Aruch that we hold like this opinion, we don't hold like that opinion. Usually, it's the rabbis are saying we want to hold like as many opinions as we can. Now, sometimes 2 opinions are opposites, so you can't hold like both, because where one rabbi says permitted, if you go one way, you're going to be disqualifying another rabbi. Eruv is the type of thing where rabbis like to go and be inclusive of as many opinions as possible. So the Rambam actually is a strict opinion that many people disregard. The Alter Rebbe actually takes it into account, and he says, no, if you can, you should try and be strict about this. And therefore, Eruv is very complicated. We're going to learn the laws of Eruvin. So we have about 16 more chapters. We have about 14 more chapters of Shabbos, and after Shabbos comes the laws of Eruvin. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in Hilchos Eruvin.
A lot of people don't know Eruv. You know what I mean, Papi? A lot of people don't know that they're
Okay.
supposed to get. A lot of people don't know where they're in. They think that there's just a city and there's 38 melachos.
Yeah. No. Well, we'll talk about it then when we get then, because there are some Eruvs which are very, very qualified, and a lot of holy people carry them.
No.
And there's some Eruvs which either have heated politics. There are literally some Eruvs where like people waited till certain rabbis died to put it up, because they, and then, there could be a lot of issues. Okay, let's go. So,
Yeah, the Eruv in Baltimore is a big deal.
did I what?
About Muncie.
What about Muncie?
Oh.
Oh, I'll tell Paul about that. Okay. Yeah, there was a Rebbe who passed away a couple weeks ago. His name called the Rachmastrivka Rebbe. He was 92 years old. He had a very big following. Anyways, they had a huge funeral procession, and they went through some town in like Muncie. So they got like a fine or something, and Muncie said, from now on, if you have such a funeral procession, you have to give us 6 months notice. Literally happened. Now you have to understand, like,
That's a catch-22.
with a guy who dies, like a Rebbe who dies like that, they likely buried him the same day, because usually most people, they have to take till overnight. But in New York, people can die in the morning, be buried in the afternoon. So it was likely the same day, Anyway, so
6 months notice.
okay,
We have
so the Baltimore area, what you were saying?
well, it's a big deal, because there's so many Orthodox rabbis there. There's a yeshiva outside the Eruv, there as well.
Well, so there are
But
likely
a lot of people do abide by it.
there are likely a lot of people who do and a lot of people who don't. Lakewood has no Eruv. The rabbi never let it because he was like, Lakewood. He looked at it like Lakewood is basically the largest yeshiva in the world. Actually, the largest yeshiva in history of the world is in Lakewood, New Jersey.
Well,
And so they in history of the universe. And so the guy who started, the whole city is built around this yeshiva. And now people complain it's become a regular city with politics and whatever it is. But he said there will never be an Eruv here because he wanted his yeshiva, he wanted the city to be a very high regard in halacha. Crown Heights is very highly debated. There is a Brooklyn Eruv, but it's very highly debated, and there are good rabbis who do it, but there isn't always a lot of, the Rebbe, I believe, didn't want an Eruv there. Most people don't carry in the Eruv. The rabbis in Crown Heights say they don't hold of the Eruv, but it's a very heated debate, and it's the type of thing where very few people understand the nuances. Even the rabbis who allow the Eruv, sometimes they don't understand the nuances, and it really comes to question. There's sometimes rabbis out there who don't understand that if they're lenient here, the people who are looking to be lenient are not looking to be more strict, and here's an exception. They're looking for more ways to be lenient. So, I don't really know. I didn't really follow. I know it's a huge war there about the Eruv. Manhattan was famous. Brooklyn, Rav Moshe Feinstein said you can't put an Eruv in Brooklyn, and they put an Eruv in Brooklyn. And the Rebbe has long letters about Eruvs, which people always try to decipher, and there's full books about it and everything like that. But there are Eruvs which are more strict, less strict. The general rule of thumb is if you're putting an Eruv on a parking lot, or on your property, or on a block between a couple houses, it's relatively easy to do. But if you're putting an Eruv in a city, it can be quite complex. Besides the city allowing it, it can be quite complex unless the city is built in a certain way where it allows, like Phoenix or different places like that. Okay, so the first mitzvah in the Torah here is kiseitze. Now the parsha is a continuation of last week's parsha. It's talking about the shoftim. These are laws which are put on the shoftim. And many years ago, I was pretty young, and I heard a rabbi give a speech in a shul, a Chabad rabbi. And he gave an amazing idea. He said, shared an amazing idea. So I figured, I asked him, I said, where's it from? He said, oh, he read it in some essay somewhere, but the author must have based it on the Rebbe's teachings. So I searched from the Rebbe's teachings, and I couldn't find it. And I searched and searched. I was maybe in my teens. And I asked a bunch of rabbis in yeshiva. Now, again, they still come out with teachings from the Rebbe today. There's so much. So I asked, and they said, I don't know, they tried to point me different places, but we couldn't find it. Anyways, only years later did I find the letter of the Rebbe. He didn't explain it as clearly as the rabbi. The Rebbe actually explained it in a much, very, very cryptic way, but it was a very, very important idea. So the first mitzvah in the parsha is if you go out to war, and Rashi says, this is a war, milchemes harashos. There's two types of wars. One type of war is a war which is a milchemes mitzvah. God says you have to fight the war against the Amalekites. Now, the milchemes mitzvah, the ones which God says, you have to kill men, women, and children. On Thursday in the bottom of the JLI class, it says, we took out the verses of Amalek about mitzvah to kill the children, how Saul killed all the children, because it's very triggering for people. People can't understand it. And essentially, it would be another class to discuss it, which it is discussed. And I've heard amazing answers about how you could kill the children and women and children, innocent women and children. It will be an amazing class. But we don't have time. Time constraints are, it's not the time. But in Milchemes Mitzvah, when the Jewish people went to conquer Israel, they had to kill all men, women, and children. They gave warning, people could run away. But all women and children, and in the case of Amalekites, all the animals. And destroy. And Amalekites have to destroy the animals, the vessels, all the houses and everything. It was really, really... So here, Rashi points out, the mitzvah here is talking about, so what happens is you have captives. And you can take one of these ladies as a captive. And I'll just tell you the halachas and how to do it. Now he says, if you're taking it as a captive, then it must be that this is not a milchemes mitzvah. This is not a war of mitzvah. This is a war of optional war. In other words, the Jewish people are allowed to have wars. We said it in last week's Parsha. They might have a war because people are harassing them. They might have a war because people are sending missiles into their land or whatever it is. But that is not a mitzvah war. That is called an option. In other words, we're conquering them for tactics. So let's say in Saul, you have Ammon and Moab, you have Ammon and the Plishtiv, those are Melchamas HaRishus. You can take whatever you want from Ammon. But the war of Amalek, that is a Melchamas mitzvah. God gave us a mitzvah to kill them. So I'll just mention, when I was a kid, I asked somebody, I said, how could they kill women and children? So they told me, they said, if you knew Hitler when he was a kid, would you kill him? I said, yes. So he said, I wouldn't, because maybe he wouldn't become Hitler. I don't know the future. But if God told me he would become Hitler, then I would kill him. God said he'll become Hitler because God knows what he'll become, right? If God told me, there's no doubt, and God told me to do it, then I would do it. It's funny because I actually think I saw Ben Shapiro say the same thing. Same exact thing, 20 years later. But it was an important point. When God gives us a mitzvah to kill people, it's not the time for us to mix our feelings or our mind into it. God knows. Now, we cannot fathom to know something absolutely. In other words, things can change. But God can tell us when something will happen absolutely. He does many times in the Torah. Now, interestingly enough, Linda Thompson sent me on Facebook yesterday. Ben Shapiro wrote, and I'll actually just quote it. She said he just wrote this, and it was actually quite in that answer. So not going to Melchamas Mitzvah, there's the idea where God says in that answer. So not going to Melchamas Mitzvah, there's the idea where God says this will absolutely happen. This you cannot see, and that's actually what Saul's mistake is. In Jewish mysticism, it says God sees, Saul sees animals, and they're good animals. But God says you cannot see what's truly good and what's truly bad. We have kosher food and non-kosher food, and in order to give us free choice, when we eat the kosher food, non-kosher food, we enjoy it, we have energy from it. We might even say, hey, I ate this non-kosher food and I will use the energy to serve God. That's literally what Saul said. But God says if you use that energy to serve God, that's the opposite purpose. You're not serving God. So anyways, Rashi starts off right away and he says, if we're talking about a case where we're taking captives, then it must be a Melchamas HaRishus. Because the Jewish people, all the mitzvahs, they had to destroy everybody when they conquered Israel. Now, someone asked in the class, and I always used to speak about this, they said, wait, this sounds like Islam, right? Now, I want to just point out that if someone comes from Islam and says, Allah told me to kill you, to murder you, we can't deny that. We can't deny that. Maybe they had a prophecy. Human beings cannot deny when someone becomes a prophet. We could say, hey, according to Jewish law, you're not a prophet. Us Jews, we don't just, if someone says, God told me this, we say, well, here's the criteria. Do you fit the criteria? You don't fit the criteria. If you fit the criteria, I'm not listening to your prophecy. I'm listening to Moses' criteria. But what we can say is we could say, well, if he wants me to subdue myself, God better tell me that. Because God told me in the Torah to protect myself. And until he tells me otherwise, I cannot subdue because I don't know if your prophecy is true or not. You know if it's true or not. I don't know if it's true or not, because if one person comes and they said they had a experience and they're the only witness of it, then we can't disprove them. So that's just usually the case. Usually when people say that, essentially what they're saying is one prophet told them, and we believe there's one God, and if a prophet comes to us and says that, he either better be backed up by Moses, or God better tell me also, because if he doesn't tell me, I won't get the memo. So here what you'll have is one person says, I was told by my prophet to kill you. A Jewish person has to say, well, we were told by my prophet, our prophet, to defend ourselves and kill you and murder you, right? And defend ourselves. So that is just in discussion here. Someone mentioned it to classes, and I think those are very interesting things because, a lot of times people say, not in God's name, violence or this or that. And theoretically, God does sometimes condone violence in certain circumstances. So anyways, here what happens, it's kind of a disturbing story in the Parsha. A guy goes to war, and he sees a beautiful lady. Now, I want to note that usually, in a lot of countries, they would make the women their human shields. and they would go and adorn the ladies to be beautiful, to weaken the hearts of the soldiers. Right? That's what they would do. So a guy sees this beautiful lady, and he really wants to marry her. He really loves her. And he takes her for a wife. So the Rashi says, we're talking about that the Torah is saying that he's going to do it anyways. So God knows that a person, he's in his warfare and he sees this beautiful lady and he sleeps with her and he's going to take her as a wife. The Torah knows he's going to take her as a wife. Just to be Jewish. So Rashi says the Torah is speaking against David. The Torah is speaking against David, right? In other words, against the Yetzer Hara. Sorry, it's really funny. Someone just put a comment. Say hi to my Uncle David. Okay. So that's why. The Torah is speaking against the Yetzer Hara. So here you have the Yetzer Hara. The guy's going to do it anyway. He's going to take the wife. The Torah says, let me tell you a way that it's permitted. Right? You got that? So really, he shouldn't be taking a wife. His Yetzer Hara is causing him to take a wife. So the Torah says, let me give you a way that's permitted. What should you do? Veisa el toich beisecha, take her to your house, shave her head, v'asa stiparna, and do her nails. This literally says do her nails. There's actually a dispute. Rashi says you grow her nails out till she becomes repulsive. The Ramban on the Torah, he says, what do you mean women growing their nails out? That's not repulsive. That's how they beautify themselves. He says you cut her nails, asa stiparna, which is interesting. Nowadays, and we find actually in Jewish law, women were putting on nail polish for hundreds of years. It's not a new thing. When Jewish law, it talks about when you're washing your hands, you can't have anything dividing between your hands and the water. So Jewish law says, what if you have nail polish? What if you have nail polish, right? What if you have nail polish? Is that a division? So Jewish law says, well, it depends. If it's done well and you don't take it off, then it's not a division. But if you're going to remove it, you have to remove it first, right? When you're watching Negelas. So anyways, this is what he says. You have her dwell in your house. Uvachsa asavia vesima. She cries for her father and mother for a month. And then afterwards, you can have relations with her and she will be your wife. And essentially, what you're going to do is convert. That's her conversion process to Judaism. So you fell in love with this lady at war. She's not Jewish. You take her in. The Torah implies, according to Rashi, that you shouldn't be doing this. You take her in. And you take her for 30 days and make her repulsive. And after 30 days, if you still want her, you can convert her and she'll be your wife. However, after 30 days, if you don't want her, you have to let her go. And the Torah says you should send her away and let her do as she wishes. You shouldn't sell her for money or keep her as a slave because you afflicted her. Now the Torah goes in and he says the next mitzvah. The next mitzvah is the mitzvah of divorce. It says if you have two wives, one you love, one you hate, right? So, both of them inherit you. You can't say the one I love, and this is what we said about Yiftach. A couple of weeks ago, Yiftach, right? He was from a wife that was hated. He was from a prostitute. Some say she wasn't even a prostitute, but she was hated. He still gets to inherit her. Now the reason why I'm going through these laws here is you'll see they're all connected. So now, the Torah, actually Rashi says, why is the parsha of divorce after the parsha of the Yefas Tayar, the beautiful wife? Because it's coming to tell us, by the way, if you take a wife like this from war, you will not love her. It's likely you'll divorce. High chances of divorce. You know, the New York Times a couple of years ago wrote an article about very high chances of divorcing if you're intermarried. And it said, why is that? Well, scientifically, because people have different values. You know, Italians love food. You know, so they'll spend more money to make their kitchen more food available. Make sure they have a 36-inch oven. Jews like food as well, but maybe not that much. You know, they don't want to spend so people have different values. But here also, if you're taking a wife like that, it might not end well. Then the Torah says the mitzvah ben soira umayra. A ben soira umayra is a rebellious, wayward son that doesn't listen to his father and mother. And there is like a list of specific things he needs to do. He needs to eat a certain amount of raw meat that he stole from them and raw wine that he drank from them. And it's only during a 6-month period of his life. So when he's a child, you can't be a Ben Soira Moira. And when you are over, you know, I think the age is 13 and a half or 12 and a half, you can no longer be a Ben Soira Moira. And the Torah is actually, there's a whole debate on what exactly it's teaching you. The Talmud simply says that this son never happened, never will happen, because he'd have to be a Torah scholar to rebel against his parents in that fashion. And the Torah is just trying to give more reward. I read in Rabbi Shais Tav's book, which is called The God of My Understanding, which is an excellent book on addiction, but it's also on non-addiction. Excellent book, The God of My Understanding. He goes through and he asks a bunch of questions on this, and he basically shows how in here the parents don't have a unified voice. If the parents don't have a unified voice, the Torah is really telling parents, if you're not teaching your kids with a unified voice, then your son will end up like this. This is what it's saying, and it never happened, never will happen, because it's not a lesson on the child not to go against the parents. It's a lesson on the parents how to raise your son. Now, why did I go through all this? Because the Rashi says that if you go and you take a second wife that you fall in love with at war, if you go do that, then what happens is you'll come to hate your child, you'll hate that wife, and you'll get divorced. And then he'll become a Ben Soira or Moira. He'll become a wayward son. And that's what the Parsha is coming to teach us. In other words, the Parsha is telling us, even though God allows you to take in a second wife, a wife, which is called Yafas Torah at war, even though you are allowed to do that, nevertheless, you shouldn't do it. It's the Yetzer Hara. It's your evil inclination. And look how bad it will end up. This is what the Torah is saying. So, no, it says that in this first one, it's the mitzvah of, well, it says, sorry, you're right. Divorce is later. This is about inheritance. So, okay. So now, this is a very interesting thing that I saw. Now, first of all, I want to mention that it always reminds me of the story. Yeah, Mendel, you're right. It doesn't mention divorce here. It mentions you have a wife that you love and a wife that you hate. So you'll end up... yeah, divorce is later in this parsha. But anyways, you end up hating one wife. You'll end up hating that wife. And you still have to give inheritance to the son. And he'll end up becoming a rebellious son. So actually, there's a very interesting... story that always reminds me of a couple years ago. In fact, when I was in New York a couple weeks ago, a Chabad rabbi called me, and he said, I saw a couple years ago you had someone who died and you needed to pay for their funeral, and you raised money very fast for it. So I told him how to do it. I said, you make a Facebook fundraiser. It's the most tremendous mitzvah to help someone be buried. We raised $5,000 in less than an hour. It was amazing to see how many Jews helping in this mitzvah. Anyways, what happened was, I remember that guy, in fact, one of the hardships I had is his next of kin lived in Japan. And her name was, I can't even remember her name, Suyimara Fugiara or something like that. And it was actually a daughter that he had when he was fighting in Japan in World War II. After the war, he met somebody and she still lived in Japan. We were able to contact her. Okay. Now, the Arizal has a very interesting interpretation on this, and this is what I want to share. And the Rebbe quotes it in a letter in the back of Likutei Sichos. So yeah, again, I made a mistake. I mixed up just later. I remember that there was divorce in this parsha, and I mentioned here again. So the guy goes, he falls in love with this lady. He can't hold back. He's going to take her as a wife. So the Torah says, stop. This is how you take her as a wife. You take her, you shave her hair, you make sure for a month that you want her indeed to be your wife, and then after that, the Torah implies that it won't be a great marriage. It won't be because you followed your lust. So the Arizal says an amazing thing. In last week's parsha it says, one of the mitzvahs, and the Rambam quotes, is when you go to war, you're not allowed to be afraid of fighting. It's a law in the Torah. You're not allowed to be afraid when you go to war. Well, what would you be afraid of when you're going to the war? What would you be afraid of? Being killed. Well, the commentaries say, well, why would you be killed? You're fighting for God. God will protect you. What would you be afraid of? You'd be afraid of your sins. Maybe God will say, it's time to knock this guy off. He sinned. So before you go to war, you have to do teshuvah. And some of the commentators say, the reason why there's these loopholes of not going to war, if you get married, if you build a new vineyard, a new house, is because some people felt they couldn't do teshuvah. So here was a loophole. The Torah gave you a loophole if you were afraid. So let's say you were afraid, you're embarrassed, something you did. So you could build a vineyard, and then you could work on teshuvah. But why? What are you afraid of? You're not afraid of the enemy, because how could you be afraid of the enemy? God promises that you're going to war for a mitzvah and everything like that. You're going to the war on behalf of the Jewish people. Must be you have a sin. So now the Arizal says something very interesting. He says, if you have a sin, you can't go to war. So that means, maybe some people will make a mistake, but that means if you're going to war, you're extremely righteous. You did teshuvah. You're extremely righteous. Right? If you're going to war. And you survived war. You're very righteous. You didn't do the sin of going to war if you have a sin. So before you went to war, you did teshuvah. Right? You have to concentrate on this. It's kind of deep. So now you go to war and you have lustful love to somebody. How could this righteous person who has no sins, who does tshuva, fall into marrying such a lady? This is what the Arizal asks. Arizal asks this question. He says, we're not talking about some brute, some thug who went to war. I was actually reading a book about the Holocaust that my son has been pushing me to read. So what he points out that in the concentration camps, who were the guards? Anyone who was civilized, who went to war as a Nazi, was put on the battlefront. The people who they couldn't trust because they were thugs, criminals, they became the officers in the concentration camps. Because let them do whatever happens to Jews. Let them do whatever happens to Jews. And he points out, this Holocaust survivor was 14 years old, 13 years old, and 14 years old at the time. He points out how the confidence of the officers, the Nazis in the concentration camp, was so low. Because they were thugs, and they were just like dogs getting bones. And if they made a mistake, they would just get shot right away. So several times he kind of used that weakness in them. But he said the real good soldiers were on the battlefront. So here also, we're talking about the prime soldiers. He falls in love with this lady. How could he fall in love with this lady? So the Arizal quotes a very interesting thing. He says, whenever a Jew really wants something, it's because your soul really wants it. So let's say you really want to eat bacon. Your soul really wants the bacon. Now, what does your soul really want in the bacon? He wants you to do the mitzvah of not eating the bacon. That's what your soul wants. Your soul wants mitzvah opportunities. So here you have something not kosher. Your soul, what happens is we mistranslate what our soul wants. And we sometimes think our soul wants this thing. But really, our body mistranslates it. Our soul wants us to do the mitzvah. If you're really righteous, and the Baal Shem Tov says this about every physical object, when you really want something you can't stop, you have to look and say, what mitzvah can I do with this thing? That's what my soul wants. A really righteous person, his body doesn't block. So he's repulsed by it. His soul wants him to do the mitzvah. A non-righteous person, his soul mistranslates and says, oh, I want this money, or I want this car, or whatever it is. The soul wants it, but not for the purpose that your body wants it. So the Baal Shem Tov says we always have to look when we really want something. It's connected with today's Hayom Yom. When we really want something, we shouldn't say, no, don't think about it. We should say, oh, I have opportunity to do a mitzvah with this thing. And find a mitzvah. Anyways, this guy really wants this lady, wants to get married to her. He's really righteous. He knows, oh boy, this lady must be determined to be converted for God. God wants me to convert her. The fact I really want her means she's meant to become a Jew and convert her. But in order to make sure, the Arizal says, I have to go through the system of converting her. She's meant to become part of the Jewish people if I really want her. So he takes her in, and after 30 days he doesn't want her. She wasn't meant to. He did this mitzvah and she wasn't meant to. But if after 30 days he really wants her, she is meant to convert. Right? So he converts and she becomes Jewish. Now he hates her, and they have a terrible son. So the Arizal says, how could it be if he's doing a mitzvah and he's following the cues that God are giving him to do the mitzvah and convert this lady? Because we know conversion is a good thing. The Talmud says the Jewish people went into exile to convert people. He's following all the cues from God. How could it be he's punished? How could it be he's punished with this terrible wife and this terrible son? Terrible son. How could it be she's punished? He's punished. So Arizal says an amazing thing. A tzaddik never feels punished. He knows that this son, this child, is not his punishment, it's his shlichus. This child, he has confidence. I'm following God. God gives me a terrible son. That's my job. My job is to educate him. It's connected. The Rebbe actually spoke about education of children once. And Chizkiyahu Melech. So I want to note that, the Rebbe, there's a verse that says, V'diglu alay ava. They jump on me with love. So the Rebbe said this talks about children who are jumping on books and destroying the books. God loves when they do it because children are innocent and they jump on the books. God's like, when an adult does it, that's terrible. When kids do it, we don't want them to break our books. but they cannot intend to do bad. So actually, by the Rebbe's Farbrengens, and the kids sat at the front, right by the Rebbe. You ever seen the video? The kids sat there, closest to the Rebbe. Now, once they become adults, though, they can sin. So Chizkiyahu HaMelech, he didn't want to get married because he didn't want to have a kid, because the prophet said your kid's going to bring idolatry to Israel. Anyways, Chizkiyahu HaMelech got very sick, and Isaiah told him, he said, you're getting sick and dying because you didn't have a child. You're supposed to have a child. He says, I don't want to have a child. You told me my child's going to destroy the Jewish people. Chizkiyahu, Isaiah tells him, he says, that's God's job. That's your child's job. Your job is to do the mitzvah of having a child. Your child has his own relationship with God, has his own thing that he's going to do when he grows older. So this is a similar thing. This tzaddik has full confidence. He knows that maybe this is because God set me up this way, that I should fall in love with her and everything like that. But this child is my shlichus. Even if he becomes a rebellious child, he is my obligation. He is a this Ben Sayer Moira, this rebellious child. This is my mission in the world. I can't give up my mission because this is the mission that God gave me. So that is how the Arizal translates it. It's a very, very deep lesson, very, very deep thing, of way of viewing life. That number one, where we end up in life may not be our fault, but it's our problem, and it's more than important, it's our shlichus. It's our mission in the world. So yeah, that's anyways something I wanted to share. I thought about that a lot. It was very, very deep of the Arizal, extremely deep lesson of the Arizal, to think about how sometimes when something bad happens to us, and it's even our fault, God still wants us to view it as if it's our mission. And I just wanted to share that today because I was excited. I found it in the Rebbe's teachings. He's quoting the Arizal. It's in Likutei Sichos. I think it's in Chelik Chavtes, book number 29. Anyways, have a great week. Any questions? So that is extremely deep Arizal teaching.